Okay, I've been getting asked how I've managed to do the gearing that I've managed to do on my gravel bike. Because I'm trying to help people who are doing vintage mountain bike conversions to gravel bikes, and I'm trying to help people use what they got instead of going out and buying all new cutting edge stuff all the time. And because I have certain reservations about running a one by setup on a gravel bike, I'm gonna tell you how I did what I did. So first of all, I had been previously running a kind of old school conventional triple chainring crankset for a mountain bike. It was a LX crankset, and which is sort of like SLX, I guess. And it was originally set up to run a fairly conventional 22, 32, 42 mountain bike triple. Yeah, so far so good. And all I did to begin with was remove the 22 inner triple chainring, and then I replaced after a little bit, I replaced the 42 tooth outer chainring with a 44 tooth outer chainring, and that got me a 32-44 double, and that was reasonably good. That worked pretty okay. But there were a couple of ongoing issues that I had. So issue number one was that because I'm running an 8-speed back end, most 8-speed cassettes and most derailleurs of that era, which I'm also running, will only handle like a 32 or a 34 tooth cog maybe in the back. 32 is really sort of conventionally the largest cog you were going to get at the time. There are, I understand, contemporary third-party cassettes in 8-speed made with much larger cogs. I was not looking to go for one of those. Okay? All right. So I'm limited to essentially a 1132 on the back of the bike. And what I found was that cruising on the road on that bike, I would be in the 44, and I would find myself often in the 13 or the 15 at sort of like my cruising speed. And that had me with very little overhead for higher gears, right? If I was on a longer downslope, I could very easily find myself pinned in the 11 with no place to go gearing wise. And that was not a super great feeling. And it also, it meant that, the high end on the bike just wasn't very high. And what I wanted was to get the chain more into the middle of the cassette during my cruising gear, so I had a little bit more overhead in either direction for adjustments, right? Okay, and so that for me seemed to indicate that I should move from a 44 to a 46 tooth chainring. And that would totally have been possible on my existing crankset, no problem at all. My existing crankset was a 4x104 bolt pattern. Again, moderately contemporary, conventional mountain bike crankset. So 4 chainring bolts on 104 millimeter spacing. Okay. The problem with 4x104 is that the minimum chainring size, that is the smallest chainring you can have that still fits on those bolts, is basically a 32. There are some people that make specialty like 31s and maybe 30s, but most of those, certainly everyone that I found, had some weird stuff with chainring bolts. It also typically was a narrow wide setup, so it was clearly being marketed for people who were going to go to a one-by setup with an existing crankset and wanted to drop their gearing down, which is fine. I got no problem with that, but you can't use narrow wides on double chainring setups. It's a very bad idea. And so it wasn't going to work for me, okay? So what I realized is that if you've been around the mountain bike game for a while, previous to the 104 millimeter 4-bolt chainring standard, there was another, there's several other standards if you go back far enough, but the previous standard was a 5-bolt 94 millimeter bolt circle standard. And you're thinking to yourself, 94? Gosh, that sounds like a contemporary Shimano thing. It is. Shimano is now using the same bolt circle size. They're using it with 4 bolts now that are asymmetric instead of 5 symmetrical bolts from back in the day. So there you are, progress, I suppose. Anyway, and it occurred to me that what with 94 millimeters being smaller than 104 millimeters, that meant that the minimum chainring size for that crankset would be smaller. And lo and behold, I found that you could get, if you looked hard enough and dug a bit, that a 29 tooth chainring exists. It was made for a 5x94 bolt circle. So I fished out that crankset, that I had withering in a box. For what it's worth, it was a Raceface North Shore XS crankset. This was a crankset made in the early 2000s, back when people were doing enormous drops to flat and were breaking everything. So it's a wildly overbuilt crankset for my current purposes, but it's okay. I'm kind of a biggish guy these days, and having an extra stiff crankset is not going to be a problem for me, and I don't really care about the extra weight, if I'm honest, because worrying about weight on a bike is just ridiculous for me. So anyway, so got that crankset, slapped the 29 tooth inner chainring on it, got a 46 tooth outer chainring for said crankset, which was annoying because I had 42s and 44s, but I didn't have a... This is my universal rule of chainrings. I have a bin of chainrings. I've probably got 50 chainrings in this bin. I never, ever have the chainring that I'm actually looking for when I go into that bin. Just doesn't matter what I'm looking for. It's not going to be there. I'll have everything else, but not the thing. Anyway, so I bought a 46 tooth and a 29 tooth, put them on the crankset. The crankset is modern, was modern enough at the time that it used the very unfortunately named ISIS bottom bracket standard, which has bearing issues, I realize, in terms of longevity, and that's fine. I'm not here to justify it. I'm here to say I had one in the bin. It was a really high quality one, and it was fine, so I installed all that into the bike. I had a number of people, naysayers, that said that it was not going to shift properly between that 29 and the 46. And here's what I can tell you is, it doesn't like being the upshift from 29 to 46. It doesn't like to be rushed, but it goes just fine. The downshift is perfectly crisp and lovely, which is the one I actually care about. When I need to bail out to the 29, I want that to happen in a rush. I typically don't mind waiting half a second for the chain to climb all the way up to the 46, because that tends to be a less panicky maneuver. I think part of the reason that people have trouble with that is because they try to run, maybe they're trying to run like a double, like a front derailleur made for a double, and that's not what I'm doing. I'm actually running a mountain bike derailleur made for a triple, and that means it's been built to accommodate that sort of sweep of gear, right? An old school mountain bike triple would have been a 22, 32, 42, or its equivalent, really. And that means from a 22 to a 42, you were looking at a 20 tooth jump, which is more than what I'm requiring of it. I'm like at 16 teeth or something like that. And okay, my math is terrible. Am I at 16? 30 to 46 would be 16. I am at 17 teeth. Yeah, so I wouldn't call the shifting up from 29 to 46 like extra crisp, but it certainly does it without much complaint, and it's totally fine. And now I've got more high end than I used to have. I've got a better usability of cruising gears, and my lowest end is now solidly below 1-to-1, all without going to a triple. I understand people these days, it's very in style to go with a 1x setup on your bike, to have a single chainring and no front derailleur and just a wide range cassette in the back. And I think that's reasonable. The problem I have with that setup personally, and this is entirely a personal thing, right, is I grew up riding road bikes with close spaced cog stacks. So I'm used to being able to make fairly fine adjustments to my cadence on the road. And I like that. It's something I'm very used to. It's something I like about road bikes. Mountain bikes, totally different thing here, right? And what I didn't like was having some giant, widely spaced cog stack on the back of the bike. Say I went to a 10-speed cassette, that's like an 1142. Well, the jumps between each cog are fairly large, which means if you only got the one chainring, if you find yourself pedaling more quickly than you'd like, or slightly more slower than you would like, and you knock it down a gear or up a gear, it's a fairly big change. What I'm able to do on my setup is run a smaller, more tightly spaced cog stack with smaller incremental changes between the gears, and still maintain the extra wide range that I want with the double chainring in the front. It's a very small sacrifice for me to run an extra chainring in a derailleur. It's something I'm used to doing anyway. Every road bike I've ever owned has been at least a double. And so for me, it's a trade-off that makes it's absolutely worth it for me. It gives me a wider range and more comfortable gearing and more choices. And for me, I think it's better. I think a lot of people overlook it. I think a lot of people shy away from front derailleurs. I will admit the front derailleurs are fickle to set up, and a lot of people have difficulty with them, but personally, I think they're probably worth the effort. In a use case like this, leave them off your mountain bike mostly, I think. Anyway, that's my gearing setup these days, and it's a delight, and you should totally give it a think. It lets you go pick up an older, less expensive crankset. It gets you access to still made, slightly esoteric chain rings, huge range of possibilities with that bolt pattern, as is obvious by the fact that Shimano has effectively returned to it, and can really get you dialed in on the gearing that you're trying to get for your use case that you are trying to do. And yours may well be different than mine, in which case your solution's going to look different than mine, and that's okay. Anyway, that's my rundown with gearing and what I did and why I did it. I needed some more low end, and I needed a little bit more high end, so I moved my chain rings in those two directions. Anywho, have a good one, and thanks for watching.